9 disgusting eating habits of Henry VIII that destroyed his body. From Europe's premier six-pack heartthrob with a 32-inch waist, this king transformed himself into a colossal mass of flesh. So heavy, he had to be hoisted onto his horse with a pulley system. Even more horrifying, he carried a necrotic, putrid-smelling leg that forced his courtiers to hold their breath. Yet he still frantically stuffed 5,000 calories down his throat every single day. His pitch-black teeth, rotting and falling out due to a bizarre addiction, even sparked the most morbid beauty trend in history. Why did the most powerful monarch in the world systematically choke the life out of himself right at the banquet table? Let's uncover the 9 most disgusting eating habits of Henry VIII. If you stick around to the very end, you'll shudder to learn which exact food drove the final nail into this king's coffin. Number 1. Stuffing a 5,000-calorie mountain of meat daily. The first habit that makes modern medicine shudder is a horrifying number: 5,000 calories a day. This isn't just an estimate. Historians have calculated this based on the Tudor royal kitchen's expense records. A single day in Henry's life was practically an extinction-level event for local wildlife. To cater to Henry's bottomless pit of a stomach, the great kitchens of Hampton Court Palace functioned like a massive slaughterhouse operating 24/7. Surviving records show that every year, over 1,200 oxen and 8,000 sheep, 2,000 pigs, and tens of thousands of poultry were brought in solely to serve the royal household, with the fattest, most succulent cuts prioritized for the king's table. Every morning, while fog still blanketed the River Thames, carts piled high with fresh animal carcasses lined up at the palace gates. The screech of knives sharpening on stone and the crunch of bones being shattered echoed relentlessly, mingling with the metallic stench of fresh blood so potent it could be smelled hundreds of meters away. Scullery maids recounted days when they had to turn dozens of giant meat spits simultaneously before roaring fires that practically blistered their faces. All to ensure that the moment the king barked, "I am hungry," the meat was ready, sizzling in its own fat and piping hot. This was no longer cooking, and it was a frenzied calorie production line feeding a growing monster. While his subjects might go a full week without a scrap of meat, Henry's banquet table was a bizarre zoological exhibition. Roasted whole cows, pigs, or sheep were far too mundane. Henry demanded opulence and the grotesque. Imagine you are a foreign ambassador, granted an audience with Henry at a dinner banquet. Before you are no delicate vegetable platters, but a pristine white swan, its beak and feet gilded with gold leaf, perched arrogantly on a silver platter. Beside it sits a peacock, painstakingly reassembled with its full, radiant plumage after being thoroughly cooked. But the pinnacle of disgust was the dolphin and seal dishes, creatures Henry deemed highly noble. This extravagance was paired with freakish ideas that would make even the bravest diners recoil. One of his absolute favorites was the cockatrice, a mythological creature birthed right in the kitchen. Chefs would take the front half of a suckling pig and stitch it tightly to the hindquarters of a large rooster. After being roasted to a golden brown and heavily spiced, the dish arrived at the table looking like a terrifying crossbred monster. Henry took immense pride in watching the horrified faces of foreign envoys when the dish was presented. He considered it the apex of creativity and absolute power. A witness from the French court once wrote in his diary, "Watching King Henry tear the stitches from that hybrid beast with his bare hands, on a grease and blood splattering onto the jewels of his crown, I felt I was witnessing a pagan sacrifice rather than a royal feast." It was these Frankenstein dishes that pumped a horrifying amount of saturated fat into his system, slowly constricting his blood vessels and destroying his cardiovascular system. Servants noted that Henry would use his massive diamond-ringed hands to rip off the fatty skin of a suckling pig, devouring the greasiest cuts, while the rendered fat dripped down his red beard. He didn't eat out of hunger. He ate to prove that the entire natural world was subjugated beneath his stomach. Those 5,000 calories were almost entirely animal protein and saturated fats, turning his bloodstream into a thick sludge, setting the stage for the agonizing bouts of gout that would soon follow. Number 2. Replacing water with 5 liters of booze every day. The second habit was born of a deadly prejudice of the era, an absolute revulsion toward plain water. In the 16th century, water in London and surrounding areas was notoriously filthy, teeming with plagues and dysentery. Therefore, Tudor citizens drank ale instead of water. But Henry VIII didn't drink ale like a commoner. He drank it like a king who knew no limits. Henry's daily alcohol intake reached a record high, roughly 10 pints. This consisted of heavy, dark ale and imported French red wines. Ale back then was thick, highly caloric, and naturally packed with a massive amount of empty calories. To truly grasp Henry's alcohol obsession, look no further than the architecture of Hampton Court Palace. In the main courtyard, Henry commissioned a magnificent brick and stone fountain. But the bizarre twist was that during festivals, this fountain didn't spout water. It gushed red wine, flowing continuously day and night, so anyone could drink themselves into a stupor. A visiting guest from the Italian court marveled in his diary, "Here, wine flows like a stream, while water is despised like the mud beneath a horse's hooves." Henry saw the rejection of water as an assertion of royalty. He believed the body of a great king must be nourished by the blood of the grape, rather than the bland, liquid peasants used to water their crops. This arrogance pumped millions of empty calories into his body, turning his gut into a massive fermentation vat and mercilessly ravaging his liver cells before he could even comprehend the danger. There is a tale passed down from the guards stationed outside the king's bedchamber. Late one night, in such agonizing pain that sleep was impossible, Henry screamed for wine while his physicians begged him to drink water to lower his fever. Flying into a blind rage, Henry hurled a heavy silver goblet at a servant and roared, "Water is only fit for washing this rotting wound, not for flowing through my veins." To Henry, alcohol wasn't just a beverage. It was an anesthetic to escape his painful reality. Little did he know, every goblet of thick red wine he downed was a dose of poison inflaming his infections. The high alcohol content dilated his blood vessels, causing his ulcers to seep more pus and toxic blood. The stench grew so overpowering that his cupbearers secretly dabbed scented oils under their noses just to avoid fainting near the throne. Number 3. Sugar addiction and the royal rotten teeth trend. The third habit brings us to one of the most horrifying visual hallmarks of Henry VIII, his pitch-black teeth and the breath of a corpse. In the 16th century, sugar wasn't a cheap supermarket commodity. It was white gold, imported from distant lands. For Henry, consuming sugar wasn't just about satisfying a sweet tooth. It was a way of screaming to the world, "I am so rich, I can eat sugar as a meal." He was heavily addicted to concentrated fruit preserves and, above all, marzipan, a paste of almond flour kneaded with a staggering amount of refined sugar, often molded into miniature palaces or animals so he could devour the world. In a specialized section of the palace kitchens known as the confectionery, artisan bakers worked tirelessly to create masterpieces called subtleties, intricate sugar and marzipan sculptures. There were sugar castles half a meter tall, complete with knights, fortresses, and little gardens entirely edible. A scullery boy recorded that the king would order a sugar army crafted just so he could bite the head off every single soldier, chewing them up while discussing politics. To produce just 1 pound of that pure white sugar, thousands of slaves in the colonies were worked to the bone under a scorching sun. But to Henry, those pounds of white gold were mere sweet toys to satisfy his cravings and prove a point. Everything beautiful and extravagant must melt on his tongue. The amount of sugar he ingested from these models was enough to send a normal person into a diabetic coma. But for Henry, it was just a snack between rounds. Imagine a royal audience at Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII sits upon his throne, draped in luxurious silks and velvet. A courtier utters a flattering remark, causing the king to let out a booming laugh. But as his lips part, the people around him have to exert immense willpower not to recoil in terror. Inside that mouth, there were no longer the gleaming white teeth of a young monarch. Instead, there were jagged, pitch-black stumps, falling out in pieces, eaten down to the root by sugar. Every time he spoke, a nauseating wave of fermenting sugar mixed with the stench of rotting flesh from his leg wafted across the room. His sugary opulence came at an excruciating price, bone-deep toothaches. In those days, there were no anesthetics, no antibiotics. When a royal tooth was hollowed out to the nerve by decay, the only solution was extraction. Records from royal physicians state that whenever Henry had to face the tooth drawer, the entire palace trembled in fear. The king was strapped tightly to a chair, 4 burly courtiers pinning his shoulders and head. The grinding screech of iron pliers clamping onto a black stub echoed alongside his agonizing roars down the halls of Whitehall. When the tooth was finally wrenched out, blood and pus seeped from the necrotic gums, releasing a stench so foul it made even the bravest men gag. Yet, even after such torture sessions, the moment the pain subsided, Henry went right back to his trays of jams and pastries. He was trapped in an endless loop, eating sugar to forget the pain, and suffering excruciating pain because of the sugar he ate. Most sickening of all was the court's reaction. Because Henry was the star of the realm, everything about him became the gold standard. The nobility began to believe that black teeth were the ultimate proof of wealth, proof they could afford sugar. They actively used graphite to dye their teeth black just to mimic the king. A dazzling dynasty defined by jet-black smiles. It was the absolute peak of decadence, now initiated by Henry purely out of an insatiable sugar habit. Number 4. Treating green vegetables as disease-causing trash. The 4th habit is a bitterly ironic medical paradox. The richest king in the world contracted the disease of the poorest men. Tudor medicine was heavily dictated by the theory of the 4 humors. They believed fresh vegetables and fruits were cold and moist, highly dangerous for the digestive systems of the elite. Henry viewed greens as filth sprouting from the dirt, fit only for peasants too poor to afford meat. For decades, hardly a single leaf of green ever graced his menu. One morning in 1544, Henry tried to push himself up from his armchair, only to immediately shriek in agony. Panicked physicians rushed to examine him and discovered bizarre dark purple bruises spreading across the king's thighs. His gums were severely swollen and bleeding profusely without any impact. These were the classic symptoms of scurvy, a disease typically reserved for sailors stranded at sea for years without fresh produce. Ironically, in the middle of a palace overflowing with provisions, Henry was slowly dying from a lack of vitamin C. Picture a gloomy afternoon in the royal bedchamber. Royal physician William Butts, one of the rare few who dared speak the truth to the king, entered carrying a small, discreetly covered basket. He knelt beside the disease-reeking bed and, trembling, presented a few fresh, juicy oranges shipped from Spain. Butts pleaded, "Your Majesty, this is medicine. And if you consume just a little juice from this fruit, the bruising on your legs will fade, and your gums will stop bleeding." Henry VIII's response was a volcanic eruption of rage. He slapped the basket away, sending the precious oranges rolling across the floor, mixing with pus and blood. Henry roared, "Who do you think I am? Some starving sailor on a rotting ship? That you force me to eat this sour, filthy fruit from the dirt?" In Henry's mind, red meat meant power and vitality, while fruits and vegetables were merely the byproducts of mud. He would rather endure flesh-tearing agony, rather let his body rot from the inside out, than degrade himself by eating what he deemed commoners' trash. This blindness was so devastating that as the fresh oranges shriveled on the floor, the king ordered a plate of grease-soaked roast beef, the very thing exacerbating his scurvy. He refused oranges, lemons, and spinach. Instead, he demanded his chefs boil fruits down into thick jams, laden with sugar and spices, until every last trace of vitamins was utterly annihilated. The king was personally swatting away his only life preserver out of a pure obsession with royal status. Number 5. The 1536 tragedy, bedridden but eating like a gladiator. We've seen the madness of Henry's daily intake: 5,000 calories, 5 liters of booze, and endless sugar. But to understand why this king entirely lost his famous 32-inch waist and literally ate himself to death, we have to look at the 5th habit, the most brutal turning point of all, to his stubborn insistence on maintaining a gladiator's diet inside a crippled body. Before 1536, Henry was a man in constant motion. His day was a whirlwind of early morning hunts, grueling tennis matches, and afternoon jousting. His body was an incredibly efficient calorie-burning machine. However, after a horrific jousting accident that shattered his legs, Henry permanently lost his mobility. Nighttime at Hampton Court Palace was not as tranquil as one might think. Inside the king's bedchamber, the air was thick with the stench of medicinal ointments, coagulated blood, and a scent far worse than anything else, the smell of rotting flesh from the necrotic ulcer on his leg. Royal physicians of the time, armed with limited knowledge, employed a barbaric treatment, and they intentionally kept the wound open by stuffing it with small gold or silver pellets so the pus could drain out. Every bandage change resulted in Henry screaming in agony. And after every single session, he would order his servants to bring in towering trays of food. He couldn't walk, he couldn't exercise, but he maintained the exact same colossal food intake, eating as if he were still galloping across hunting fields. Layers of fat began to encase his body, crushing his internal organs. Consider the workshop of Erasmus, the veteran armorer at the Tower of London. For 2 decades, Erasmus had measured every centimeter of Henry's physique. He recounted that during the king's youth, forging Henry's armor was a matter of immense pride. It was like sculpting perfect muscular curves out of steel. But after 1536, the job morphed into a silent nightmare. Every year, the king sent his old armor back to the forge with a singular, uncompromising order: expand it. The ring of Erasmus's hammer on the anvil was no longer meant to craft elegant silhouettes, but to rivet crude, clumsy steel extensions onto the stomach and hips. There were times when the king came for a direct fitting, and Erasmus broke into a cold sweat because his measuring tape was simply not long enough to wrap around His Majesty's waist. He realized with horror that the chest plate, once the ultimate symbol of martial prowess, was now entirely overshadowed by a massive mound of fat cascading from above. More terrifying still was the sound. Erasmus noted that whenever Henry moved in his newly adjusted armor, the steel joints didn't emit the sharp, metallic clank of a warrior, but rather an agonizing groan, as if the metal was fighting against a catastrophic internal pressure. The armor no longer protected the king from enemy lances. It acted like a steel cage desperately trying to keep that colossal mass of flesh from bursting open. It was here that the blacksmiths began to whisper a bitter truth. Their king was no longer a man wearing armor, but a creature trapped within his own excess. In just a few short years, his regal belly sagged down to his thighs, and his 54-inch waist became a living testament to absolute loss of control. This was no longer fueling a body, and it was the helpless overcompensation of a god brought to his knees by his own broken legs. Number 6. Binge eating in the dark. As his body grew grotesquely oversized and his legs wept pus uncontrollably, Henry faced a massive psychological hurdle: deep shame. The sixth habit marks the total collapse of his dignity, his self-imposed isolation while eating. He no longer wished to appear in public. Henry retreated to his privy chamber, a hyper-exclusive space accessible only to his closest attendants, known as the grooms of the stool. Do you know the actual duty of a groom of the stool? They were responsible for the king's most intimate bathroom needs. A revolting job, yet one that granted supreme political power because they were the only ones who saw Henry's true physical ruin. One member of this inner circle documented the atmosphere behind those heavy oak doors in secret letters. He described how, whenever Henry retreated into his private sanctum, he would order all the heavy velvet curtains drawn shut to completely block out the sun. The suffocating scent of expensive incense and scented candles could not mask the distinct smell of a body decomposing while still alive. In the flickering candlelight, Henry's shadow cast against the wall looked like a massive, formless entity. These servants didn't just serve food. They bore witness to the great King of England struggling to wedge his body into a custom-built armchair, his agonizing leg propped up on a high footstool. They acted as the vessels containing all of Henry's shame, and, in exchange, they were permitted to bring platters of grease-soaked meat into a room devoid of judgment or documentation. Here, no diplomatic protocols or banquet etiquette could restrain him. Without his queen watching, without his advisors intervening, he allowed himself to stuff his face until he could physically swallow no more. There were nights when Henry's binging bordered on sheer madness. An eyewitness recounted seeing the king, consumed by pain and despair, using his bare hands to scoop fistfuls of stewed meat directly into his mouth, splashing dark gravy all over priceless royal tapestries. At that moment, table manners ceased to exist. Henry abandoned silver knives and forks. He used his pudgy, diamond-clad fingers to rip apart roasted chickens. The grooms had to suppress their nausea as they wiped the excess grease and scattered food from his beard and silk robes. They were strictly forbidden from making eye contact, because in those moments, Henry didn't want to be seen as a human being. In the pitch black of the privy chamber, he was reduced to a gluttonous creature trying desperately to digest his own misery. This isolation was the perfect incubator for disgusting eating habits designed to mask his paralyzing fear of impending death. Number 7. The Midnight Feast Schedule. If the privy chamber was how Henry hid his physical decay, the seventh habit was a cruel manipulation of time. The horror wasn't just that he ate alone, but the sheer frequency, a never-ending banquet that robbed the entire palace infrastructure of sleep. His main meal typically began at 11 a.m., the standard dinner time for the era. But for Henry, 11 a.m. was merely the starting pistol. After packing away kilos of game meat and liters of wine, he didn't rest. Instead, he entered a state of continuous chewing that lasted right until bedtime. And even when night fell, the craving never ceased. If you stood in the rear courtyard of Hampton Court at 2 a.m., you would see thick plumes of smoke billowing from the massive kitchen chimneys. Down in the great kitchens, hundreds of cooks and scullions were toiling like slaves in a coal mine. Listen to the account of Thomas, a kitchen clerk who frequently stayed awake under flickering candlelight to audit the food consumption. In his secret journals, Thomas described how, while the whole city of London slept in silent darkness, Hampton Court Palace felt like an unquenchable inferno. The relentless chopping of knives on wooden blocks, the sizzle of beef fat on giant spits, and the metallic tang of fresh blood mingling with heavy spices filled the air. Why were they working through the night? Because the king could wake up at any moment, writhing in pain from insomnia, and demand a roasted leg of mutton or a tray of pastries. Thomas recorded a typical incident at 3 a.m. A pale, breathless courtier sprinted into the kitchens, brandishing a piece of parchment bearing the king's red wax seal. And Henry had woken abruptly from a nightmare or a sudden flare of joint pain, and rather than calling a doctor, he ordered an immediate secondary feast. The demanded list made the exhausted cooks, who had been dozing by the hearths, leap up in sheer terror. 3 honey-roasted chickens, a massive platter of spiced beef tongue, and 2 flagons of the darkest red wine. Thomas described the nightmare scenario. We had to race against the clock as if we were at war. The clatter of leather boots on stone floors, the screaming of the head chef, and the suffocating reek of hot grease trapped in the enclosed space. When the food tray was presented, His Majesty needed no silverware. He pounced on the meat like a starving wolf, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, and chugged the wine as if trying to extinguish a fire burning inside his chest. It was these midnight snacks that turned Henry into a slave to his own kitchens. He never allowed his stomach a single moment of emptiness. His digestive system was forced into a 24/7 overdrive, stripping away the body's final chance to heal and leaving his internal organs permanently inflamed and swollen, even while the rest of the world slept. Number 8. Plugging the stomach with cheese. The 8th habit was a bizarre but highly destructive practice, using cheese and sweets to fill the gaps. After ingesting enough animal protein to feed a small platoon, Henry often worried that he was still slightly hungry, and he held a blind belief that pungent cheese and heavily spiced hot pastries would help cork his stomach, aiding digestion. In reality, he was pouring gasoline on a fire. Even after he had polished off 20 different meat dishes, the king would demand a block of aged cheddar cheese, the size of a human head and reeking pungently. Henry didn't slice it delicately to savor the flavor. He took his personal dagger, gouged out massive chunks, and hastily shoved them into his mouth. He believed this dense, fatty food acted as a cork, sealing off any incomplete digestion and making him feel entirely satiated. But the physical toll was unimaginable. The purines from the meat combined with the saturated fats from the cheese and the heavy red wine, turned Henry's bloodstream into a dense saline solution. Here, uric acid crystals precipitated, embedding themselves directly into his joints like thousands of red-hot needles. On a freezing winter night in 1546, the entire palace was jolted awake by a horrifying roar. It wasn't the roar of a tiger or a lion, but the agonized screams of Henry VIII. He was suffering an acute gout attack. Picture razor-sharp uric acid crystals acting like shattered glass, driving deep into the joints of the king's toes and ankles. With every beat of his heart, the pain sliced through his flesh like a blade. By this point, the king's feet had lost all recognizable shape. They were swollen, bright red, and stretched so tight they looked ready to burst. Henry lay in bed, wildly swinging his sword, threatening to execute any doctor who dared touch his leg. And the hypersensitivity of the disease was so severe that attendants were forbidden from letting even the lightest linen bedsheet brush against his toe. A mere draught of air, or the weight of a single falling feather, was enough to make the king scream, as if he were being roasted in open flames. The once majestic monarch was now a weak, trembling shell, terrified of a thin piece of cloth, in excruciating agony, all thanks to the massive blocks of fatty cheese he shoved down his throat to plug his bottomless stomach. Number 9. Using food as a psychological painkiller. The final habit is also the most deeply psychological, using food to numb the shattering of his own soul. Henry VIII wasn't merely a glutton, he was a deeply lonely and paranoid man. After executing Anne Boleyn, and later Catherine Howard, and watching his closest friends mount the executioner's scaffold, Henry plunged into a black hole of depression. He had no therapist, he only had sugar and fat. In the final days of January 1547, Henry lay helpless in his gargantuan bed. He no longer possessed the strength to chew through tough game meats. By now, the only thing he could swallow was soft marzipan, crafted from premium almond paste, loaded with a terrifying amount of refined sugar, and wrapped entirely in gold leaf. He firmly believed gold was an immortal metal, and eating it would prolong his life. But, in a cruel twist of irony, it was the dense sugar in that luxurious marzipan that drove the final nail into his coffin. The sugar sent his type 2 diabetes into a catastrophic spiral, causing the necrosis in his leg to erupt into an uncontrollable systemic infection. The gold leaf didn't save him. It only made his demise more opulent and far more bitter. Sir Anthony Denny, keeper of the Privy Purse, documented the haunting final moments inside that sealed bedchamber at Whitehall. He wrote that although the king was too weak to lift his own heavy arm, his obsession with sweets had not died out. The royal confectioners crafted one final piece of marzipan for him, a miniature crown, molded entirely from pristine white almond paste and encased in gold leaf so impossibly thin it fluttered with the slightest breath. As Denny placed the confection into Henry's mouth, he had to hold his breath to keep from passing out. And the sweet scent of almond and honey was completely devoured by the overwhelming stench radiating from the king's lungs and rotting flesh. Henry lacked the strength to chew. He simply lay there, letting the solid gold pastry melt over a tongue blackened by tooth decay. Denny described it. The king smiled, a twisted grimace amid swollen masses of flesh. He closed his eyes as if swallowing that final drop of sugar was the greatest victory of his life. The sight of a man who once held the power of life and death, now lying at death's door just waiting for the artificial sweetness of a gold leaf, is the most agonizing testament to an empire's collapse. Henry spent his entire life trying to eat the world, and up to his very last second, he was still trying to swallow the shimmering illusion of power, even if it was just a piece of sugar cake, accelerating his descent into the grave. On January 28, 1547, the great king drew his final breath inside a 400-pound body, rotting from the inside out. Henry VIII died because he chose to eat everything he wanted, rather than what he needed. Henry VIII passed away at the age of 56, an age not exceptionally old, even in the 16th century. He left behind a fractured kingdom, an empty treasury, and the most expensive medical lesson in history. His final image was not a warrior on horseback, but a decaying mass of flesh resting atop a mountain of unimaginable wealth. Macabre legends suggest that because his corpse was so massive and bloated with gases from decomposing fat and sugar, his lead coffin actually burst open during its journey to burial, spilling the blood and flesh of the great king onto the ground, a spectacularly horrifying end for a life dedicated to devouring the world. Henry VIII won every battle for power, but he lost the most brutal war of all, the war against his own mouth. Absolute power without self-control ultimately led to a lonely, agonizing death at the banquet table. The story of Henry VIII is a chilling warning against excess. Which of these 9 habits do you find the most terrifying? The black teeth as a symbol of wealth, or the coffin bursting open from excess fat? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you are fascinated by the dark, haunting, and forgotten corners of history like this, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming documentaries. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the stomach of history today. Farewell, and see you in the next mystery.